We've been discussing the concept of Yichud Hashem, the echod that we say in the Shema. Yichud means not that he's one of a kind, but rather everything emanates from him. And we're going to see something profound. We're going to explain this even to a greater extent. He presented many positions of idolatry, deities. Now, God created a system, a very exact system. The world has to function in a very exact way. And if you behave a certain way, the world responds positively. If we don't behave in that way, the world reacts to the misbehavior of mankind. So existence, the physical existence, is all a mirror image of man's behavior, the way God created this world. And everything is limited, even though it responds or reacts to man's behavior, it's within limit, because the world is finite. But all that finiteness, there's certain laws which are etched in stone. What the idolaters believed, that God, even though he created this existence, he cannot override the system. And it's possible even Paro believed this. And when Moshe comes in the name of God to release the Jews, to free the Jews, he says, I don't buy it. I don't accept it. He may have been the creator, but once he created this existence, he cannot override the system. We explained to you, a person builds a certain safe, impregnable safe, and he has the code to open it up, the combination. But if you lock him in that safe, he can't get out of that safe. But he developed it. It was his ingenious how to put that all together, how to construct it. Doesn't make a difference. But you could be actually a captive in what you created. You're locked in. God created a system. He's locked into that system. There's certain orders and protocols of existence. Can't override those systems. Proof in the pudding is, look at the zodiac. The zodiac says so. But even the zodiac, the way it functions, it only functions that way because God wills it should function that way. But if God should ever want to change it or override it or dispel it, he can. Why? Because it's not you have a system and you have God. So not two separate things. The system is the expression of God's will. And if you understand it that way, it's only etched in stone, because even the stone that it's etched into is only exists because God wills the stone should be there. And therefore you have the etchings in that stone. But if he should ever choose or will it differently, it's different. That's the understand. That's Yichud Hashem. That's the unity of God. The ultimate objective of creation is that mankind should come to the understanding that everything emanates from God. But he said something phenomenal, which we can discuss in a moment. There are many things we don't understand. We have all kinds of species. You have domesticated species, you have undomesticated species, you have reptiles, you have fish, you have insects, you have all these things. And each one in its own right is unique and has its own function, its own DNA, and its own system. What do we need all this for? When God will reveal his unity at the end of time, that everything emanates from him, in retrospect, we'll understand why every aspect of creation, the so-called borders on the infinite, is necessary to ultimately to come, they're all components to come to the understanding, to recognize God's unity. But we won't know that till the end of time. In retrospect, then we'll see it. I'd once mentioned something It's a allegory from the Ramchal, which he writes something phenomenal. When I give you the allegory, you'll understand what it is from the Vilna Gaon. At one scene in the Ramchal, in the second volume of the Knowing Heart, there's another second volume which he writes. We find in the Gemara, the Talmud, there's a concept known as Gamzu Latova. It's for the best. And there was a man, why do we say Gamzu Latova? Because there was a person who was the teacher of Rabbi Akiva. His name was Nochum Ish Gamzu. Nochum, he was known the man of Gamzu. Why was it called Nochum, the man of Gamzu? This was the Rebbe of Rabbi Akiva. Was anything that happened in his life, regardless of what it was, it could have been the most ominous moment. He internalized it, it's for the best. And it always turned out for the best. And that was his belief. The Gemara tells over a story that there was a decree against the Jewish people by the Romans. And if the decree would have been carried out, the Jews wouldn't be able to survive that decree. So they needed an advocate to go to Rome and plead before the Roman emperor to annul the decree against the Jews. So they were concerned, who are they going to send? They have to send a person who's well acquainted with miracles. God performs miracles on his behalf. That means he has to have special merit. Who did they choose? Nochum Shgamzu. Nochum, the man of Gamzu. So what do? So they're going to send him to Rome. He has a wagon, a coach, and they fill a large wooden chest with diamonds and jewelry and gold, that when he goes before the emperor, that will be the gift he's going to present to the emperor. And afterwards, he'll plead the case of the Jews. And hopefully, because he's a person who's well-weathered in miracles, God will perform a miracle, he'll be the agent on behalf of the Jewish people. He goes, travels. It wasn't a one-day trip from Israel to Rome. So he had to stay over at an inn at a certain location. The innkeeper and his family were evil. And they started to inquire to this rabbi, this Jew. They saw this very ornate wooden box chest, and they wouldn't share it with him. He wouldn't share with them what's in the box. Okay? But they had their eye on him. And also they notice how before he retires, goes to sleep, he buries the chest in the ground. And the next day when he leaves, he's going to unearth it. So they immediately knew there's something very valuable in that chest. What did they do? They unearthed the chest, unknowing to him, and they saw it was filled with diamonds and jewels and gold, and they emptied it, and they filled it with earth and reburied it. Next morning, Nochum Ish Gamzu awakens, unearths the chest, puts it in the coach, he's on his way to Rome. And they presents this ornate chest to the Roman emperor to show how much the Jews revere him and they value him. And they open the chest and they see it's filled with earth, with dirt. The Roman emperor becomes incensed, livid. He says, whatever the decree is, it's going to be worse, and you're going straight to the gallows. So what do you think Nochum, the man of Gamzu, says? Gamzu Latova. That's what God wants. Go to the gallows. It's for the best. Immediately, Eliyahu Novi, Elijah the prophet, comes in the form of one of the members of the Roman Senate. And he says to the emperor, one moment, don't be so upset. The earth in that box is probably the earth which, when Avram, the founding patriarch of Jewish people, went to war against the four mightiest kings, it says in the Talmud that he took earth and he threw the earth at the enemy, and it became like bullets, and straw became like spears. And that's how we vanquished the enemies, the four mightiest powers of the world. That dirt in that box, maybe it's that dirt. Same dirt. So it's more valuable than gems and gold and everything else. So the emperor says, I'll stay the execution for a while. We have some provinces, outlying provinces, which are rebelling against us. We can't quash it. We're going to take this dirt, this earth, send it out there, and they'll use it against the enemy. And sure enough, what did they do? They tested it, and it worked. They defeated all these rebellious provinces, and they took control. So what did they do to Menachem Gamzu? He was a hero. They filled the box with diamonds and golds and jewels and gold, sent them back to Yerushalayim, and the decree was annulled. As he's traveling back, they were shocked. They didn't think, the innkeeper with his family didn't think they'd see him again. After delivering a box of dirt from their backyard, he thought his life would be over. So they asked him, what happened? He says, you don't understand. I got a hero's welcome over there and a hero's departure. It's unbelievable. And that's all he said. So they realized that the earth they have in their backyard is miracle earth. So what did they do? They dug up the earth and they filled up a whole wagon load and they took it to Rome and they said to the Roman governor, you know, that chest that this Jew brought, that earth came from our backyard. Here's a whole wagon load of it. The emperor was excited. So there was another area which they were rebelling against the emperor, and they did a test run. They take the dirt and use it, and all the Roman soldiers are killed. So they went and they executed this innkeeper with his family. That's the story. Menachem Gamzu. So we say, Gamzu Latova, he said, whatever happened, it's for the best. Whenever we say it's for the best, what does that always mean? We don't understand why it's for the best, but the times where in our own lifetimes, we see it's truly for the best. I'll give you an example. There was a certain person, he worked for one of the people in Yad Avram, and his father was Jewish and his mother was Jewish, and his father was a famous band leader. And his first name was Nicholas, because his father wasn't Jewish. He's given a non-Jewish name, Nicholas. And he was becoming a little bit of a Baal Tshuva, becoming observant. And he worked for Nathan Lowe. And he worked hard. And they were building a foundry in China. And they had a bid on the project. It was up for bid. And this Nicholas worked very hard for it. And the one who bid for it outbid them, and they lost the bid. The bid was at $25 billion, and they offered 18 or 20. So they lost the bid. So this young man who's just become Baal Tshuva was very disappointed. Here he worked so hard to raise the money, convinced the people that with that kind of money we'll definitely get it, and they lost it. So Nathan Lowe says to this person, it's for the best, Gamzu Latova, for the best. This would be for the best. The amount of money we could have made if we would have gotten that project would have been literally a fortune. Okay. Month passes. There's an earthquake in this area, China. The foundation they already poured, which cost them about $10 million or $15 million, as a result of the earthquake moving the earth, the ground, it cracked. So $15 million of laying the foundation for this foundry was worthless, was wasted. So Nathan says, didn't I tell you it's for the best? If we would have raised the money, we would have lost it. The project wouldn't have happened. So thank God we didn't have it. Gamzu Latova. That's the example. So there in your own life, you see it's for the best. A person was supposed to get on the plane and he had an ear infection. And he didn't go on the plane crashes. He said, thank God I had the ear infection. Gamzu Latova, right? That's an example, Gamzu Latova. So I once shared this with someone, and he said to me, the Ramchal says, no, even though we see it in our own lifetime, that it's for the best, but in the ultimate sense, it's much more than that. Why? Every generation, every person who walks the face of this earth is a spoke in the wheel of the ultimate continuum of history, from the first moment till the end of existence. And every aspect, every event that takes place contributes that ultimately the unity of God should be appreciated. And only in retrospect are you going to appreciate every event that happened and how every event and every incident that happened was essential, that ultimately the unity of God should be appreciated. And to fully appreciate it, you have to be exposed to all the events of history, and only then do you appreciate what it means, the unity of God. But you have to see the unity of God, only then do you appreciate why everything that preceded was necessary to see that. So when I shared with someone what the Ramchal says, the person says, there's a famous allegory from the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon explains to it an allegory. He says that there was this king who was the wealthiest king in the world. And the Talmud tells us the different grades of gold. There's a type of gold, which is the most precious gold. It's called Zov Paz, P-A-Z, Paz gold. It's the equivalent, it's worth multiples and multiples of any other kind of gold. If an ounce is so much, 1 ounce of this is worth 500 times the value of ordinary gold. Very rare type of gold. And this king, he had everything in the world, and he could have everything in the world. He says, I would like my regal garment to be made of this kind of gold, and gold thread should be made of this kind of gold. So he went to his courtiers. They said, you know something, there's no one person who has the amount of gold that's needed to produce your regal garment. We're gonna have to travel around the world gathering all this kind of gold to get enough gold together, this quality gold, to make this regal garment for you. He says, fine, no problem. Whatever it takes, as long as it takes, I'm designating you to be my agent. You're going to travel the world and you're going to gather enough gold. So he goes to his personal tailor, and they asked the tailor, how much gold do you need? So he told him a certain amount. It took about 2 years till they gathered all the gold. They accumulated the gold, comes to the tailor. Tailor says, now you have to give it to your goldsmith. They have to hammer out sheets, and we have to turn it into threads. Thread, okay? So the king's tailor measures him, and he asked the tailor, how long do you think it would take to make this garment? He says, about 3 years. This 3 years. He says, fine, 3 years. After 3 years, the garment is finished, and he comes for a fitting. The king comes for a fitting, and there's a mirror, the height of the king, and he puts on this regal garment made of this precious gold, and he looks in the mirror, and he nearly passes out. He can't believe what he sees. The level of regalness, there's a radiance. He's never seen anything of this in his life. He saw everything. This he's never seen. And he praises the tailor for his tailorship, his workmanship. It's one of a kind. And the tailor is beaming. Then he says to the tailor, you know something? Although you did a phenomenal job, you're going to be put to death. Because from my understanding, I'm no fool. The amount of gold I gave you to make this garment, you embezzled, you siphoned on some gold because you didn't use all the gold. Because when I see this garment, I make an evaluation, this garment does not contain all the gold you were given. So therefore, by siphoning off you the small amount of gold, it's worth a fortune. So you're a thief. For that, you deserve to be put to death. Okay? That's what the king says to this tailor. Taylor pleads his case. He says, God forbid, I'm honest. And he says, I'll prove it. He says, but the only way I can prove it, I have to take the garment. He says, you understand, you see, by the sleeves, they're pleats, it's pleated. So therefore, what you see, you don't see what's needed to create that effect of the pleats and folds and this and that. But if you understand what it takes to make this effect, you don't understand that every ounce of gold you gave me is in the garment. He said, I don't believe it. He says, the tailor says, there's only one way for me to prove it. I have to take the garment and unravel it and bring it back to the thread. And when I undo the garment and bring it back, unravel it, then you'll see that every ounce of gold that I may put into this garment was necessary to bring about this complete garment. So the king says, I'll let you prove your innocence. So he goes and unravels the garment and puts it back to thread. And now you see the whole extent of thread, how much thread was needed to make this garment. And he was vindicated. But when the king saw the garment, he says, I don't understand it. Only after you unravel it, you begin understanding it. So the Vilna Gaon says, at the end of time, There are many things we don't understand. We don't understand the Holocaust. We don't understand the pogroms. We don't understand people's suffering. We don't understand many things. The evil thrive. Many things we don't understand. He says, but at the end of time, when the world will recognize God's unity, in retrospect, you will understand why every event that took place was necessary to come to the conclusion that everything emanates from God. Because without that, it's impossible to have the full picture of what it means. God is the source of everything for every moment. That's what the Vilna Gaon says. So therefore, the Ramchal says, every aspect of creation, every species, whatever it may be, whatever level of life it may be, whether it's fish, whether it's land-based, whatever it may be, whether it's vegetation, everything that exists is necessary ultimately at the end of time to be able to appreciate that everything emanates from God. So he said, why? What do we need it for? If God wanted us to appreciate unity, he should have created a world which reflects his infinite ability. So Ramchal says, no, that since everything is given and subject to choice, we have many gray areas. And that gray area you could read many ways. And it's based on what? On what kind of choice you make. So all these, the environment, the components, the aspects, the events of existence, it all plays into free choice. And only through that free choice, by man making the right choice, will ultimately bring the world at the end of time to that level of perfection. And then will be worthy to see God's unity. And then in retrospect, we'll understand why every event down the pike was necessary for that. Just to give you a little inkling. We understand that if a person eats something which is tainted, even the person may not die, he becomes sick. You become ill from it. Why? Because the body can't process the bacteria or whatever is in that food item, or if you're in the environment and you're exposed to certain gases, you become compromised. That's just the reality. When you sin or you don't believe in certain beliefs, it generates an impurity. That impurity compromises your soul. As a result of that, you have to be rehabilitated. And because you actually become compromised, the level of clarity you could have, you don't have. So everything itself is due to very often to our own choices. And if it's not our choices, let's say you're born into a world which the whole world has been compromised. But every person is put in a position that you have the wherewithal that despite the compromised environment, you could still see it right. And you could come to an understanding that it's God, that whatever happens, but you're not going to have a full appreciation for that. Only at the end of time, you'll understand why is it necessary to have a compromised, and the choice has to manifest itself in that context. Only at the end of time, you'll have to understand why that had to be the context. Avraham Avinu was born into a pagan world. God's existence wasn't even known. Despite that, he came upon God. And that ultimately contributed to what? That he was the founding father of the Jewish people, who ultimately stood at Sinai and accepted the Torah unequivocally, which is the basis for the perfection of existence, which is the objective of existence. But all that, Avram's achievement is something phenomenal. How does a man who's blind, how does he have such clarity? It's pitch dark. There's no even inkling of light, and yet he was able to come upon the truth. So what was the value of his accomplishment? Despite not knowing it, not seeing it, and despite the whole world rejecting it, and despite the fact is that they rejected him, and they wanted to destroy him, he survived it all. He weathered every storm. So what is the value of Avram? He became the founding father of the Jewish people, which ultimately his progeny were the ones who stood at Sinai to receive God's Torah and be taken as God's people. So it's only due to the lack, and then you come upon it, then you say, I see, said the blind man. Very often. You don't see it. Later you see, but even when you see it, you don't still don't see the full picture. At the end of time, we'll be merit to see the whole picture. And then when we see the whole picture, in retrospect, we'll understand that every event that preceded the revelation of the full picture was necessary to contributed to be worthy to see that full picture. In the first bracha of the Amidah of the Shemona Esrei, we say, Zocher chasdei avos. God remembers the kindness of the patriarchs. Right? You say, Zocher chasdei avos. He remembers the kindness of the patriarchs. Umevi goel livnei b'neihem. And he brings the Redeemer to the children of their children, mean to their descendants. Lamad shmo bi'avo. He brings the Redeemer to their progeny for the sake of his name out of love. What exactly saying? Zocher chasdei avos. I mean, are we so undeserving that God should continuously will this world? Why does God give us endless chances? The answer is, you know why? Because we still have money in the bank. You'll get credit as long as you have money in the bank, as long as you have what to give for collateral. The patriarchs generated such an unlimited amount of merit. We being their descendants, we could draw on their merit. Therefore, God gives us endless opportunities. As much as we fail, it's not over yet. Why? Because the patriarchs themselves generated such value and such worthiness that we're still drawing on their account. This is the Zoche Chazdei Avos. But what happens when that account's going to be depleted? The only reason why God gives us choice is because we still have the merits of the patriarchs. God's giving, I'll give you another chance. What if we exhausted all the chances? So what does God do then? There's no longer free choice because you don't deserve it. He brings the Redeemer, Lamad Shmo Bi'avo, for the sake of his name out of love. What does that mean? We're undeserving. We failed at every opportunity. We had the choice. We made the wrong choice. We drew on the account of the patriarchs and we depleted the account. We exhausted everything there. It's bone dry. You know something, if we failed so seriously, throw us overboard. But it says no. God brings the Redeemer for their descendants for the sake of his name out of love. After everything's said and done, we are still the children of the patriarchs. And because what the patriarchs did for this existence, introducing God, and the progeny stood at Sinai, and there was that special moment that they met the objective of being worthy to accept the mechanism which will bring this world to perfection. Even if they should fail at the end of time, I will still bring the Redeemer. And they will still have a share in the world to come. They'll be part of that. Why? Because God writes the rules. God is the rule. That's Yichud Hashem. This is the unity of God. God is the master. Just as a king could pardon, the person is deserving to put to death, but if the king chooses to pardon that person, he lives. He can. God being the basis for all existence, God says, even though you may fail and there's no longer merit to draw from that, it could be attributed to yourselves, which we explained. The whole idea, because it's attributed to yourself, that means you're creating the commonality, because it was due to your own initiative, even though you did not. Nevertheless, whatever you achieved, you'll be there. Why? For the sake of his name, out of love. What's his name? Odon. He's the master. Yud K Vav K. He's infinite, was, is, and in the future. Since everything emanates from him, even if you don't meet that criteria, God could override the system. God could override the system because the system, he is the system. The system only functions in that context because he wills that's what it should be, because that's within the context of choice to bring about that recognition. But if you should fail, after everything's said and done, God still says it's okay. Because you were the descendants of the patriarchs, you'll be part of eternity. That's the understanding. It's interesting. The Moshe Cordovero, he authored a work called the Palm Tree of Dvorah, which he speaks about the 13 attributes of mercy. He writes over there that one of the attributes of mercy is a person doesn't have a shred of worthiness, not a shred. But nevertheless, somehow, God could pull out of his hat, kaviyachol, a reason why that person should be able to merit mercy. You have no merit, but God somehow is very creative that you could be worthy of mercy. How's that? We just read in last week's reading, when the Jews left Egypt, it says they were rushed out. The dough didn't have a chance to rise, and therefore it was this matzah. It was this unleavened bread, these matzah cakes. And the Torah goes to tell us, and they did not prepare provisions to go into the desert. It's explicit in Torah, in last week's reading. They did not prepare provisions to go into the desert. What does Torah share with that with us? So Rashi cites the Minchas to share with us the praiseworthiness of the Jews. This is only a fifth of Jews who left Egypt. That although they didn't have provisions, and they could have said, how could they go into a desert, which it's impossible to survive without provisions, a desert which you can't even plant there. But they didn't ask that question. They went into the desert with total faith in God, that God will provide for them. But you know what level of faith you have to have, what trust you have to have? And God says, it's a verse in Jeremiah, God said, I will never forget the kindness of your youth. The kindness of youth, to go after me in the desert, a land that hasn't been planted. How do you do it? The love of when we originally began our relationship. I will never forget it. So the Ramak or Moshe Cordovero says, you have a newborn child. I couldn't care what his parents are. And the newborn child is pure and innocent. And then afterwards, as he develops and grows into adulthood, he turns into a monster. But when he was a child, when he was a newborn baby and a little child, he was innocent, he was pure. God says, when you began, you were pure as snow, as with the pristine whiteness of snow. You went into a desert with no background of spirituality. All you were exposed to the plagues for 10 months. You were idolaters. And yet you had sufficient trust in me. You went into a desert. I will not forget that. Never forget that. What about all this baggage we have? All this debt we have? God says, now something? I call the shots. Because I am the master. Because everything emanates from me. And I could actually will whatever it is. So because I remember that origin, where you come from, I will never forget that. And that will always be there for you to draw on that. So even though the merits of the patriarchs are exhausted or depleted, there's maybe God of them for the sake of his name, out of love. What's the love? The love is Avos Klusayich, the love of our original when the relationship began. Because of that love, you went into the desert. Because you appreciated God despite your weak background. But who could do that? Only the master. The master who he is the system. Because the system says there is worthiness, not worthy. You're not worthy. God says, I call the shots. Because the system only functions that way when I will, it should function that way. But if I choose to override the system, it functions as I will it should function. Therefore, these people will have a share in the world to come. They will be part of eternity, despite the level of failing. But only God can make that evaluation, even the failing, when, where, and how. Because there will be people that are not going to merit to be part of that eternity. We're talking about the Jewish people as a whole. Today's day and age, you have certain places in the United States, the assimilation rate is 80%. It's mind-boggling. 70 years ago, we had a physical Holocaust. Today, we have a spiritual Holocaust. A fifth of the Jews left Egypt. 4/5 perished in the days of darkness because they had no interest in leaving Egypt. And therefore, the value of a Jew is only that he should stand at Sinai and become God's people. And if you're not interested in leaving Egypt, your life has no value. Either you're part of the chosen people or just an ordinary human being. And for the Jew not to be at Sinai, because he's not interested in leaving, that Jew perishes during the days of darkness the way the Egyptians perished. Now, what is the core of the Jewish people today? We have a very committed core, despite what the world is, despite the assimilation rate. The Torah is vibrant, functioning, and spiritualizing that core, and the core is broadening. You know, in the 50s, the average family, observant Jews, how many children do they have? They had 2 children, 3 children. Today, you have families where having 8 children is not out of the ordinary. Having 10 children is not ordinary. And how are they raised? They're raised in a way with the environment is an environment which is totally committed to God's prescription of life. Although you find the kids at risk, children rebel, they go out, but the vast majority remain committed. And they raise their families up with that standard of commitment. So the core is broadening and wider and deeper, and the periphery is falling off the edge of the earth. Literally, same idea. Why is God allowing it to happen? 4/5 didn't make it. Only a fifth made it out. It's something similar. The majority of Jews are disappearing due to assimilation. But the core, which is about a fifth of that number, is committed and remaining with Judaism. But even within the core, are they so perfect? No, they're not perfect. But at least they identify. They want to be Jewish. We're not perfect. We're far from perfect. What if a person says, to me, marrying a non-Jew, I prefer a non-Jew over a Jew. I don't want to have any Jewish identity. Even my name, I'm going to change it because, I prefer not to have such a Jewish name. And I'll have the plastic surgery so I shouldn't look like a Jew. Schumer, he says, I'm a Jew. Look at his face, he sees a Jew. Right? He wouldn't go to have plastic surgery. He shouldn't look like a Jew. Right? I'm not getting into politics, but that's Schumer. And he voted for the Iran deal. Although Israel was opposed to it, but he's a good Jew. I'm not talking about religiosity. I'm talking about Jewish identity. But he eats those bagels and lox like nobody ate bagels and lox with cream cheese, Philadelphia cream cheese, not just ordinary cream cheese. And he eats Levy's rye with the Chinaman on it. You got it? Even that's kind of rye bread with caraway seeds, which today I'm not sure if they still have caraway seeds in the rye bread. Okay, I'm gonna take